Today, I want to tell you a story so haunting it left scars on the land itself. Deep in the unforgiving Wild West. This was a place where whispers could kill, where power ruled louder than law, and one wrong choice could seal a person's fate. It all started with something simple. A young woman asking for honest work. A moment so small, no one imagined it would awaken greed, hatred, and a storm of blood. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sun above Asheville Crossing burned like a pitiless judge, beating down on the land until the cracked soil seemed to beg for mercy that never came. The town itself looked less like a settlement and more like a wound carved into the frontier, a jagged mark left behind by men who refused to leave. A cluster of wooden buildings, sun-bleached to a lifeless gray, leaned toward one another as if seeking comfort from the emptiness around them. When the wind stirred, it carried only dust and the sharp, bitter breath of sage. In this stretch of the old American West, the law survived only as a rumor muttered by tired officials, while real power spoke loud and clear from the man who owned the most land and the fastest guns. Evelyn Crowan arrived beneath the brutal midday glare, stepping down from a dust-choked stagecoach like a spirit pulled from the road itself. She carried one small, battered valise, everything she possessed in the world, and inside it, a single dress. Once bright with calico color, it was now faded thin and stitched again and again by careful hands. At 19, her face still held traces of youth, but her eyes, the pale blue of a sky before a summer storm, carried a sorrow far older than her years. She was beautiful in the way wildflowers are beautiful, fragile, quiet, and easily destroyed beneath an uncaring heel. The moment the town noticed her, the murmurs began. In Asheville Crossing, whispers were currency, traded across saloon counters and passed between shelves of dry goods. A young woman alone, without a man's name to shield her, became many things at once. Curiosity, danger, temptation. Respectable women tightened their mouths and drew their children close as she walked by. The men, lingering in narrow strips of shade, watched her with a different hunger, a measuring stare that made Evelyn's skin prickle. They mistook her poverty for moral weakness, her solitude for permission. She felt their eyes like hands pressing against her back. Only weeks earlier, she had buried her mother. 2 weeks after that, her father. The drought had devoured their farm inch by inch, until nothing remained but unpaid debts and 2 crude wooden crosses standing lonely on a barren rise. Asheville Crossing was her final hope, a place to earn work, to survive another season. She guarded her innocence like armor, the last inheritance of a life already gone. But in this town, innocence was simply another thing men believed could be taken. From the shaded porch of the land office, 2 men observed her arrival. One was Vailor Blackrin, thick through the neck and broad in the chest, his wealth gleaming from polished boots and silver conchos at his belt. He ruled the Blackrin holdings, and his ambition stretched as wide as the territory he meant to own. To him, land, cattle, and people were all property waiting to be claimed. His gaze slid over Evelyn with the same calculating hunger he reserved for fertile pasture. "Fresh meat," he muttered, lips twisting as he spoke to the man beside him. That man was Thorne Calderix. He stood slightly apart, shaped from silence and restraint, taller than most, shoulders heavy with the weight of long labor. He carried authority without display, needing no ornament to announce it. A widower, the town knew, though no one dared mention it aloud. Years earlier, sickness had torn through his homestead, stealing his wife Elowen Calderix and their young son Cale within the same cursed week. What remained was a man who ran the largest ranch in the region, the ash veil spread with cold precision and relentless discipline. His gray eyes followed Evelyn quietly, unreadable. Where Blackrin saw possession, Thorn recognized something else, a desperation he knew too well. Blackrin's greed buzzed at the edge of his patience, like an insect he refused to swat. He despised the man's hunger, for land, for dominance, for the breaking of others. It was a sickness, and Blackrin thrived on spreading it. Evelyn's first stop was the general store, a cramped space thick with the smell of leather, dust, and roasted coffee. She needed work, any work. Sewing, cooking, washing, it didn't matter. Her pride tightened painfully in her chest, but hunger spoke louder. As she stepped inside, several cowboys turned from the counter, spurs clinking with lazy confidence. The brand stamped on their belts told her all she needed to know. Blackrin riders. "Well now," one drawled, eyes dragging slowly over her. He was young, but cruelty already hardened his features. Evelyn ignored him, fixing her attention on the storekeeper, Bren Hollow, who suddenly found great interest in polishing wood that was already clean. Another man stepped into her path. "You lost, little miss?" He grinned. "Or you looking for a special kind of work?" Laughter followed him, thickening the air until it felt hard to breathe. Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs. She lifted her chin. Her voice came soft, but it did not shake. "I'm looking for honest work. Do you know of any?" The first cowboy barked a laugh. "Honest work." He reached out, fingers brushing the worn fabric of her valise. "A pretty thing like you don't need to worry about that. Mr. Blackrin's a generous man." The meaning behind the words struck harder than a slap. Evelyn recoiled, color draining from her face. "Please," she said quietly, "just let me pass." "Not so quick," the second man replied, the smile fading from his mouth. "We're only being friendly." He stepped closer, backing her toward a barrel of flour. Behind the counter, Bren Hollow looked away, fear winning over conscience. And in that moment, the door creaked open behind them. His silence, that cold, unspoken agreement, was simply how things worked in Ashevale Crossing. You did not challenge Valor Blackrin, and you certainly did not cross his men. That truth hung heavy in the air when the screen door suddenly creaked open and a long shadow spilled across the store floor. Thorn Calderix filled the doorway. He said nothing. He didn't reach for a gun. He only stood there, solid, unmoving. His gray eyes sweeping from the cowboys to Evelyn Crowan, absorbing the scene with a calm so sharp it chilled the room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The careless swagger drained away like fog under morning sun. Boots scraped, shoulders stiffened. Confidence curdled into quiet resentment. "That's enough," Thorn said at last. His voice was low, not an order, but a certainty. "Leave the girl alone." The man closest to Evelyn bristled, clinging to what little pride he had left. "We ain't doing nothing, Calderix, just talking." Thorn stepped forward once. He didn't look at the cowboy. His attention never left Evelyn. In his gaze flickered something brief, recognition, maybe pity, the look of someone who had seen fear before and remembered it too well. "Your talking's done," he said evenly. "Now get out." Silence tightened the room. The men glanced at one another, 3 against 1. Yet no one moved. Crossing Thorn Calderix wasn't a choice made lightly. They knew the stories. They knew what kind of man he was. With muttered curses, they shoved past him and spilled back into the street, spurs ringing with the hollow sound of retreat. Only then did Bren Hollow clear his throat, his voice thin and uneasy. "Can I help you, Mr. Calderix?" Thorn didn't answer. He turned to Evelyn, who stood shaking, her knuckles white around the handle of her valise. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked. His tone softened. She nodded, unable to force words past the tight ache in her throat. Gratitude tangled painfully with shame. She understood what this meant now. She wasn't just a poor girl anymore. She was a point of friction, a spark between the two most powerful men in the region. "You're looking for work," Thorn said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn swallowed. "Yes, sir. Anything." He studied her carefully. He saw the pride fighting fear in her eyes, the roughness in her hands that spoke of labor, not comfort. And something about her, that quiet endurance, stirred a memory of Alawan Calderix, sharp enough to ache. Thorn trusted instinct more than words, and his told him the town's whispers were lies. He was also practical. His cook had vanished a week earlier with a traveling salesman, and the Ashvale hands were already grumbling about scorched beans and bitter coffee. "I need a cook and housekeeper at my ranch," he said plainly. "The work's hard, the pay's fair. You'll have your own room." He paused once. "You interested?" Evelyn stared at him. A job, a real one, offered without mockery or expectation. It felt like a rope thrown to a drowning soul. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, sir. Thank you. My wagon's outside." "Get your things," Thorn said. Then he turned and walked out without another word, leaving her standing in the sudden stillness of the store. Behind her, Bren Hollow found courage only after danger had passed. "Be careful, miss," he muttered. "You've stepped into something now. Calderix and Blackrin, they don't mix." Evelyn understood. By accepting Thorn Calderix's help, she had chosen a side in a conflict she barely understood. When she stepped back into the blinding sunlight, she saw Valor Blackrin across the street, his expression carved from pure fury. The Blackrin rider stood at his shoulder, watching her every move. Then she looked to the wagon, where Thorn waited, face unreadable. She was trapped between quiet protection and open hatred, between two men whose rivalry could tear Ashvale Crossing apart. As she climbed onto the wagon's seat and left the whispers behind, Evelyn knew one thing with certainty. Her life of simple hardship was over. A far more dangerous road had just begun. She understood then that she wasn't riding toward a simple job. She was moving straight into a future she could never have imagined. What had once been her quiet struggle against judgment and hunger had twisted into something far larger. Her fate was now tangled in a bitter rivalry that had burned for years between two powerful ranchers. A war of land, of pride, and now, of her. The journey to the Calderix ranch passed in silence. The wagon wheels creaked over stone and dry earth, carrying her farther from the gossip-choked streets of Ashvale Crossing with every turn. Evelyn Crowan sat stiffly on the buckboard, hands folded tight in her lap, keenly aware of the man beside her. Thorn Calderix held the reins with steady confidence, his movements controlled and effortless. His eyes stayed fixed on the distant line of mountains. He seemed less a man than part of the land itself, weathered, restrained, and impossibly vast. He offered no small talk, and Evelyn, burdened by gratitude and intimidated by his silence, dared not break it. They passed through a narrow stone gateway marked by a burned wooden sign, Calderix. Beyond it, the world changed. The dying scrubland gave way to wide, rolling grass that shimmered beneath the sun. Strong cattle, all branded with the same clean mark, grazed across the slopes. This was no modest holding. It was a dominion built with sweat, discipline, and time. The ranch house rested among tall cottonwoods, a rare green refuge nourished by some hidden creek. Thick stone walls and heavy timbers formed a two-story structure meant to endure both brutal winters and merciless summers. It felt less like a home and more like a stronghold. As the wagon approached, several men emerged from the barn and bunkhouse. Their steps slowed when they noticed her. Thorne reined in the horses. "This is Evelyn Crowan," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "She'll be running the kitchen from now on." He let his gaze sweep the group. "You'll treat her with respect. Brusque Halden, show her the cook's room. The rest of you, back to work." The men, lean, sun-cut, and hardened by years outdoors, nodded without comment. There were no smiles, only curiosity, and the quiet obedience reserved for a man whose word was law. An older cowboy stepped forward, his face weathered but gentle, mustache drooping beneath a tired grin. "Mom," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Brusque, this way." He led her inside. The house was spotless and orderly, yet stripped of warmth. Dark timber, worn leather chairs, the lingering scent of tobacco and cold ash. Nothing decorative, nothing soft, no trace of laughter ever echoing through its halls. It felt less like a home than a disciplined barracks. Her room sat just off the kitchen. Small, plain, but clean. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the yard. To Evelyn, it felt like sanctuary. Her new life began before sunrise the next morning. The kitchen, long neglected, became her territory. The pantry was well supplied, proof of Thorne's foresight, if not his comfort. She scrubbed every surface until it shone, fed the wood stove, and by the time the first light crept across the yard, the smell of fresh coffee, crisp bacon, and rising biscuits filled the air. When the Ashevale hands entered for breakfast, they froze. They were used to scorched beans and bitter brew, a clean table, steaming plates, and coffee that didn't taste like ash felt nothing short of miraculous. They ate in stunned silence. Evelyn moved smoothly among them, refilling cups and platters with quiet efficiency. She didn't press conversation, sensing this was a brotherhood slow to trust strangers. Her work would have to speak for her, and it did. Days became a week. A rhythm settled in. Small changes followed her presence. Wildflowers set in a jar on the table, freshly washed curtains rehung straight, the steady aroma of baking bread drifting through the afternoons. The men softened. They began calling her Miss Evelyn. Their voices around her lost their roughest edges. Loyalty bound them to Thorne, and if he had brought her here, then she belonged. Her tireless effort and the undeniable excellence of her cooking sealed that acceptance. The moment that truly anchored her place came without warning. A young, overconfident hand named Cale Morin was breaking a new bronc when the horse exploded beneath him. The animal bucked violently, throwing him hard to the ground. Cale hit with a sickening thud, his arm twisting at an unnatural angle. His cry cut sharp through the yard. Men ran from every direction. They carried him inside, his face drained of color, blood spilling from a deep gash along his brow. The Ashevale hands hovered helplessly, men skilled with rope and rifle, but lost when flesh and bone failed. "Someone ride for the doctor," Brusque Halden barked. And in that moment, Evelyn stepped forward. "That's a 4-hour ride," one of the men muttered grimly. "One way." Before anyone else could speak, Evelyn Crowan stepped through the circle of dust-covered, helpless faces. "Bring him to the kitchen table," she said firmly, "and fetch clean water, whiskey, and the sewing kit from my room." Her voice was calm, steady enough to cut through the panic. The authority in her tone startled them. Without argument, the men moved. They didn't know that farm life had hardened her early, that she'd tended more broken bodies, animal and human, than they could imagine. With unwavering hands, she cleaned the deep cut along Cale Moran's forehead. He sucked in a sharp breath as she poured whiskey into the wound. "This will sting," she said gently. Then she stitched the gash with small, careful movements. Neat work meant to leave little trace behind. When she examined his arm, the problem was clear. The shoulder was out of place. She turned to brusque Halden. "I'll need you and one more to hold him steady. This part will hurt worse." Under her direction, they braced him. With a swift, practiced motion, she reset the joint. Kyle let out a raw cry before sagging back, breath shuddering with relief. Evelyn fashioned a sling from a clean dish towel, her expression focused, unreadable. When she finished, she cooled his brow with a damp cloth. The men stared. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't fainted. She had taken command quietly, with competence that carried more weight than shouting ever could. From that day forward, their respect was no longer polite obligation. She wasn't just the cook anymore. She was one of them. But while Evelyn was being woven into the life of the ranch, Valor Blackrin was working to tear her name apart back in Asheville Crossing. When Brusque returned from town on the next supply run, his face was drawn tight. He found Thorne Calderix near the corral. "Boss," he said low, "you ought to hear what Blackrin's men are saying." Thorne didn't look up. "They're spreading talk, saying Evelyn ain't just your cook, claiming you brought her here for reasons that ain't decent." Thorne's jaw hardened. His gray eyes turned to stone. He'd expected it. Blackrin always fought dirty, striking at reputation, honor, weakness. By giving Evelyn shelter, Thorne had unknowingly painted a target on her back. "Let them talk," he said coldly. "Their words ain't worth the breath it takes to say 'em." "Maybe not," Brusque replied. "But folks are listening, and once dirt sticks..." Thorne knew the truth of it. Once thrown, mud never fully washed away. The thought of Evelyn's name dragged through filth lit something fierce inside him. A protective fury he hadn't felt in years. Without meaning to, he began watching her more closely. He noticed how the evening sun caught threads of gold in her hair while she fed the chickens. He heard her humming softly as she kneaded dough. He saw the genuine concern in her eyes each time she checked Cale's healing arm. Slowly, almost against his will, the house, long a tomb of memory, began to breathe again. Warmth crept into spaces that had been cold for years. The feeling unsettled him. One evening, he entered the main room and found her standing before the unused fireplace, her expression distant. On the mantel sat a small, silver-framed photograph, the only one he allowed himself to keep. Elowyn Calderix, smiling, dark-eyed, alive, holding their infant son, Cale. Evelyn noticed him and turned quickly, color rising along her neck. "I'm sorry, Mr. Calderix. I wasn't meaning to pry." "It's all right," he said, though his voice came rougher than intended. He stepped forward and lifted the frame, his thumb brushing the glass over his wife's face. The sound of her laughter, the memory of her touch, the weight of his son in his arms. Grief surged back without mercy, threatening to pull him under. He had built walls for years to survive that pain. And somehow, this quiet young woman had found every crack. The warmth he'd begun to feel twisted suddenly into fear. To feel again meant risking loss again. And he could not survive that, not twice. His eyes shuddered. The distance returned. "The fire needs wood," he said curtly. Then he turned and left her standing in the sudden, empty silence. Evelyn remained there, confused and wounded. She had sensed something growing between them, an unspoken understanding. Now it was gone, sealed behind ice. She didn't know the shape of his grief, only its chill. Combined with the whispers she'd begun overhearing among the men, it weighed heavily on her heart. Outside, the town, led by Blackrin, was determined to brand her a fallen woman. Inside, her own feelings were beginning to unravel, and Evelyn Crowan realized she was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the world and one within herself. She had come to the Caldericks ranch seeking nothing more than safety and the chance to survive. That was the promise she'd made to herself. Work hard, remain distant, protect what little dignity she still possessed. Yet somewhere along the way, her thoughts betrayed her. She no longer saw Thorne Caldericks only as her employer. She saw the man beneath the silence, a lonely soul burdened by grief, too heavy for one heart to bear. His restraint drew her in, and when she caught the sorrow flickering behind his eyes, something unfamiliar tightened painfully in her chest. The feeling frightened her. Caring for him was dangerous. It shattered the careful boundaries she had built. Worse, it gave life to the very rumors she despised. To feel anything at all made her vulnerable, and vulnerability in Ashvale Crossing was a luxury she could not afford. She stood torn between guarding her heart, the last thing that truly belonged to her, and the pulls she felt toward the man who had offered her protection, only to push her away without explanation. The town saw her as a sinner. Inside herself, she felt something far more terrifying awakening. The fragile beginnings of a love she had never asked for and didn't know how to resist. The cold distance Thorne placed between them lingered for days, an unseen frost settling over the house. Evelyn Crowan carried out her duties with quiet discipline, her chest aching with questions she dared not voice. At times, the ranch felt like a dwelling of ghosts, and its master the most haunted of them all. The Ashvale hands, unaware of the subtle shift between their boss and the young woman, continued treating her with rough, brotherly respect. It was that hard-earned camaraderie that would soon fracture the tension, in a way no one expected. It happened in the main corral. A new hand, a 17-year-old boy named Ryan Vossel, all bravado and little sense, was trying to work a half-wild Mustang. The horse was a magnificent creature of muscle and panic, its eyes rolling white with fear. Ryan pushed too hard, too loud, too fast. The animal finally snapped. It reared high, screaming, front hooves slicing the air. Ryan was thrown clear, landing hard in the dust. In the chaos, a loose coil of rope snagged the horse's hind leg, yanking it tight against a fence post. Panic exploded. Trapped and terrified, the Mustang thrashed violently, striking the rails and threatening to shatter its own leg. Men shouted from every direction, their panic feeding the animal's frenzy. Ryan scrambled away on hands and knees, face drained of color. Thorne was already striding from the barn, his expression dark with command, ready to take control. Before he could speak, a calm voice cut clean through the noise. "Everyone, be still." It was Evelyn. She stood near the fence, having stepped outside to shake out a tablecloth. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady with resolve. She slipped between the rails and began moving slowly toward the frantic horse. "Evelyn, get back!" Thorne shouted, fear sharpening his voice. She didn't turn. Keeping her body low, she approached in a gentle arc, hands open, movements measured. "Easy now," she murmured softly. Her voice carried the same tone she once used with frightened calves and restless chickens. Easy, boy. No one's gonna hurt you. The Mustang continued to strain, sides heaving, yet its wild gaze locked onto her. Gradually, the thrashing slowed. The yard fell silent. The men watched, transfixed. She kept speaking, a stream of quiet nonsense and soothing words, never breaking eye contact. When she drew close, she extended her hand, palm open. The horse snorted, nostrils flaring, but did not flee. Inching forward, step by careful step, she closed the distance. Then, in one fluid motion, she drew the small paring knife she always kept tucked inside her apron. With a swift slice, she cut the taut rope. The moment the pressure released, the Mustang leaped backward, snorted once, then bolted across the corral, stopping only at the far rail, trembling but unharmed. A collective breath escaped the men. Ryan stared, mouth open. Thorne stood frozen. His heart pounded violently, not from anger, but from terror he hadn't admitted even to himself. He had watched her walk into the reach of hooves that could have killed her, utterly powerless to stop it. In that moment, he saw her not as fragile, but as a woman of profound, quiet courage. The wall he'd built around his heart didn't merely crack, it collapsed. That evening, he found her tidying the kitchen. "What you did today?" he began, his voice rough, unsteady. "That was a damn foolish thing." Evelyn turned to face him, her expression calm, unreadable. "It was the only thing to do," she said quietly. "That horse would have broken its leg. You could have been killed." Thorne Calderick's voice came out rough, tight with emotion he hadn't meant to reveal. "I grew up on a farm," Evelyn Crowan replied gently. "Fear is a language animals understand. You just have to know how to speak it." He studied her then, truly studied her, and for the first time saw beyond the worn dress and quiet sorrow. Beneath it lay something unshakable, a core of strength forged by hardship, not broken by it. In that moment, he understood how badly he had misjudged her, how deeply his own ghosts had clouded his sight. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said at last, the name settling naturally on his tongue, "for saving the horse and the boy." From that day forward, something between them changed. The stiff distance of Mr. Calderick's and Miss Crowan quietly disappeared. He began calling her Evelyn, and after some hesitation, she started calling him Thorne. He trusted her with more than the kitchen. He showed her the ranch ledgers, and her careful handwriting soon brought order to accounts long neglected. He asked her thoughts on a bull he was considering buying. He found himself inventing reasons to return to the house when he would normally be riding the range. Small moments, shared work, soft conversations at dusk. Slowly, a fragile but steady bond formed between them. Its turning point came on a cool Saturday night. When the final cattle branding was complete, the Ashevale hands built a great bonfire in the yard. Tern Fox, armed with a battered fiddle and far more enthusiasm than talent, scraped out lively tunes that were good enough once whiskey started flowing. The men laughed, drank, and swapped exaggerated tales, their faces glowing red in the firelight. Evelyn stood near the edge of the flames, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She felt both included and apart, surrounded by rough men, yet closer to family than she'd been in years. Thorne leaned against a porch post, a mug of coffee in his hand, a rare hint of a smile touching his mouth as he watched his men. Across the dancing flames, their eyes met. The noise faded to a distant murmur. In that look, Evelyn saw not just a ranch owner, but a man worn thin by loneliness. And in his gaze, she saw longing that mirrored her own. Thorne pushed off the post and walked toward her. The men quieted slightly, sensing something momentous. He stopped before her, firelight carving shadows across his face. "Evelyn," he said softly, "would you dance with me?" A silent breath seemed to pass through the circle. Thorn Calderix did not dance. Her breath caught. She nodded. He took her hand, his palm warm, calloused, steady, and guided her toward the open space by the fire. One hand settled at her waist. She placed hers lightly on his shoulder. Sensing the moment, Taryn slowed the tune into a simple, aching waltz. At first they moved awkwardly, two people unused to closeness. Then the rhythm found them. The world narrowed to firelight, fiddle strings, and the man holding her. She looked up and saw tenderness in his eyes, unguarded and raw. And for the first time since Eloan Calderix died, Thorn felt something he thought lost forever. The quiet, honest comfort of holding a woman. It wasn't betrayal of the past. It was a whisper of a future. He drew her a little closer. She leaned into him, feeling safe, feeling chosen. Their moment was so complete that neither noticed the rider watching from the darkness beyond the yard. The next afternoon, Evelyn walked to the narrow creek bordering the property to gather mint. As she knelt by the water, a shadow stretched across her hands. She looked up. Vylor Blackrin sat astride a black stallion, staring down at her like a hawk sizing prey. Cold rushed through her. "Mr. Blackrin," she said, rising slowly. "Miss Crowan," he replied smoothly as he dismounted. "Working hard, as always. Calderix has you fetching weeds now." "They're for tea," she answered, lifting her chin. "Of course." He stepped closer, his presence heavy, suffocating. "I've been hearing things in town, things about you." His mouth curved faintly. "A shame, really. A young woman having her name dragged through the dirt." "I imagine it is," Evelyn said evenly. He chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Don't misunderstand. I don't believe a word of it. I think you're a victim." She said nothing. "Stuck out here with a man who prefers the company of ghosts," he continued. "A man who lets his cook dance in the dust because he can't give her a proper ballroom." His words were meant to wound. Instead, they hardened her resolve. "I am not a victim," she said firmly. "And I am not stuck." Blackrin's smile vanished, replaced by something sharp and predatory. "Are you?" he asked quietly. Then he leaned closer. "I'll speak plain. This is no life for you. Leave Calderix." "Come with me," Vylor Blackrin said smoothly. "I'll place you as housekeeper at my ranch. You'll wear fine dresses, sleep in a warm house, walk through town with your head held high." He stepped closer. "I can give you protection. I can give you anything you want." The meaning beneath his words hung thick and rotten in the air. A wave of revulsion rolled through Evelyn Crowan. "My loyalty isn't for sale, Mr. Blackrin." "Loyalty?" he scoffed. "Loyalty to what? A broken man and a stretch of dry land?" His eyes hardened. "I'm offering you a future, a safe one." He gestured toward the distant town. "Stay here, and Ashvale Crossing will tear you apart. They're already sharpening their knives." "No," Evelyn said. The word clear, steady, unshaking. "Thorn Calderix gave me work when I had nothing. He gave me respect. That matters more than any dress you could buy." She tried to step past him. He blocked her path. "You're making a mistake, girl," he hissed, his face dark with fury. "A big one. You'll regret it." For one long, terrifying moment, he held her gaze. Then he turned sharply, mounted his horse, and rode off, leaving the bitter weight of his threat behind. Evelyn ran back toward the house, her heart hammering. She said nothing to Thorn. She refused to pour oil onto the fire already burning between the two men. But Valor Blackrin kept his word. 2 days later, Brusque Halden returned from Asheville Crossing with a face grim as a winter grave. He found Thorn and Evelyn in the kitchen, bent over the supply ledgers. "Thorn," Brusque said without preamble, "it's bad. Blackrin's been talking to everyone, the preacher, the mayor's wife, half the town. He's calling Evelyn a stain on the territory, says she's a corrupting influence. He's stirred folks into a frenzy." "Let them talk," Thorn growled, though a tight line carved itself between his eyes. "It's past talk now," Brusque said quietly, glancing at Evelyn. "They've called a town meeting for Saturday." Thorn stilled. "The council's calling a public hearing about the moral condition of the Caldericks ranch." Brusque drew a breath. They aimed to drive her out. The words settled over the house like a burial shroud. The days leading up to the meeting were heavy with unspoken dread. Every man among the Asheville hands knew what was at stake. A grim loyalty took hold of them, quiet, watchful, unyielding. They were Caldericks' men, and Evelyn was under their protection. But this enemy could not be met with fists or gunfire. That helplessness poisoned the air. Thorn became a storm locked behind iron bars. He worked himself and his men mercilessly, as if labor alone could build a wall high enough to stop Blackrin's poison. Yet whenever he looked at Evelyn, at the tension in her shoulders, the shadows in her eyes, a cold fury twisted in his gut. This was his doing. He had pulled her into his war. The evening before the meeting, the sky began to bruise, purple bleeding into sickly yellow-gray. The air turned heavy, breathless. Birds fell silent. Pressure mounted, echoing the dread inside the house. Then the wind whispered, a low moan that swelled into a scream. Fat drops of rain struck the dust like thrown coins. And within moments, the heavens broke open. Not a cleansing rain, a violent deluge. Water slammed sideways under gale-force winds. Thunder cracked directly overhead, rattling the beams. Lightning split the sky into jagged white scars, flashing horrifying glimpses of a world gone mad. The hands rushed to secure the livestock. Inside, Thorn and Evelyn worked together, hauling the heavy storm shutters closed, one by one. Darkness swallowed the rooms until only lamplight remained. Dim, flickering, intimate. The storm roared without mercy, cutting them off from the world beyond the walls. When everything was secured, they found themselves in the kitchen, the warm heart of the house. The iron stove glowed red, a small island of order against the chaos. Rain battered the roof like a war drum. They stood on opposite sides of the room. The space between them pulsed with everything unsaid. The storm had stripped away distance, excuses, escape. There was only this night, this room, this reckoning. "I should leave," Evelyn said quietly, her voice nearly lost beneath the thunder. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the rain sliding down the window pane in long, trembling trails. "In the morning," Evelyn Crowan said quietly, "before the meeting, it would be easier if I wasn't here." Thorn Caldericks slammed his palm against the heavy table. The crack echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. "No." The word tore from him, raw with fury. "You're not running. We're not running." "It isn't running," she said, finally turning toward him. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "It's protecting you. Your name. This ranch." She swallowed. "Valor Blackrin is doing this because of me. If I'm gone, if you're gone, he wins." Thorne's voice rose, breaking with emotion he could no longer cage. He paced the narrow space between the stove and the table like a trapped animal. "You think this was ever just about you?" he snapped. "It was always going to be something. Water rights, a fence line, a stray calf. He wants to break me." He stopped abruptly. "You're just the weapon he chose." "I don't want to be a weapon," she whispered. Thorne turned his back to her. His broad shoulders shook, barely contained. "And I don't want you hurt," he said. When he faced her again, the anger was gone. In its place was something that stole her breath. Naked, aching fear. The armor of the unbreakable rancher had fallen away, revealing a man terrified of loss. "I buried my wife and my son in the same week," he said hoarsely. Every word came from a wound that had never healed. "I buried my heart with them." He shook his head. "I swore I'd never feel again. It was safer that way. Just work the land. Let the years pass." He stepped closer, his gray eyes burning. "Then you came. Quiet, strong. You walked into this house and brought it back to life." His voice cracked. "You brought me back to life." A bitter breath escaped him. "And I hate myself for it." He dragged a hand through his hair. "Because all I can think about is tomorrow. About them forcing you away. And the thought of losing you." His voice broke completely. "It feels like burying them all over again. I can't survive that. Not twice." His confession shattered her defenses. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, not from despair, but from the overwhelming truth of him. This was the man behind the silence, the heart beneath the iron. She crossed the space between them and lifted her hands to his face, her palms warm against his rough jaw. "Thorne," she breathed. "When I came here, I was afraid of the town, of being alone, of what people would say." Her voice trembled. "But I was wrong." She looked straight into his eyes. "The only thing I'm truly afraid of is losing you. I think I have been from the very beginning." Something inside him gave way. With a sound that was half anguish, half relief, he pulled her into his arms. The embrace wasn't gentle, it was desperate, as if he were clinging to the only solid thing left in the storm. She held him just as tightly, burying her face against his shoulder. Outside, thunder raged. Inside, two lonely lives collided and held fast. After a long moment, he pulled back enough to see her. His thumbs brushed away her tears. Then he lowered his head. Their lips met, not in hesitation, but in deep, aching recognition. A kiss born of grief, longing, and the promise of something neither had dared to hope for. When they parted, both were breathless. The air between them felt alive, humming. He guided her toward the small woven rug near the warm stove. They knelt facing one another in the lamplight, the storm fading into distant thunder. The world beyond the walls ceased to exist. With careful hands, he reached for the high collar of her dress, his movements unsure but reverent. Each button undone felt like a vow, slow, deliberate, full of trust. His eyes never left hers, seeking permission in every breath. When his fingers brushed the warm skin at her collarbone, the firelight flickered, and so did something new and fragile between them. A sharp tremor ran through Evelyn Crowan. She stood on the edge of something terrifying, the final step where fear and surrender met. All the town's whispers, all the looks that branded women before they ever spoke, all the grief she had carried since losing everything. It surged up inside her at once. When Thorn Calderick's fingers brushed the line of her shoulder, she startled and pulled back. "Please." Her voice broke into a trembling whisper. "Not there." It was the last defense she had left, the final wall around a heart that had survived on endurance alone. To give that part of herself meant risking complete ruin or complete trust. Thorn stopped instantly. He looked into her eyes and understood. She wasn't refusing him. She was revealing herself. He leaned forward until his forehead rested gently against hers, his breath warm, steady. When he spoke, there was no command in his voice, only certainty. A vow. "I've got you now," he said quietly. He wasn't taking anything from her. He was accepting the weight of her fear, claiming the duty to protect it, to guard it, to love the part of her that trembled most. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow, but release. He had seen her weakness, and he hadn't turned away. When he kissed her again, the urgency was gone. What remained was something deeper, calm, sure, unshakable. He eased her down onto the small rug near the stove, his movements reverent, almost prayerful. Beyond the walls, the storm still raged, wind screaming, rain battering the roof. But inside the kitchen, there was only warmth and quiet resolve. What joined them then was not desperation. It was choice, a promise made without witnesses. Later, when the thunder softened into a steady rhythm above them, they lay wrapped together beneath a blanket, the glow of the embers painting the room in gold. The loneliness that had haunted both their lives had finally loosened its grip. They were no longer a guarded rancher and a frightened woman seeking shelter. They were a single stand. "Tomorrow," Evelyn whispered into the stillness. Thorn drew her closer, his lips brushing her hair. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "We face them together." They both knew the truth. This night hadn't erased the danger. It had sharpened it. Their love, now undeniable, would be seen as defiance. Voilor Blackrin would not accept it. The town would not soften easily. The storm outside was ending. The greater one awaited them at dawn. Morning broke clean and bright. The rain had scoured the land, leaving the air crisp and sharp, the earth dark and rich with new scent. Yet inside the Calderick's house, the quiet carried weight, not fear, but resolve. They moved around each other in the kitchen with wordless understanding, two people bound now by more than circumstance. When Thorn brought the wagon around, he lifted Evelyn onto the seat not as an employer might, but with the steady, protective care of a man who had chosen her openly. The ride toward Ashvale Crossing felt nothing like her first arrival. She no longer sat alone. Her hand rested calmly on his arm, a simple gesture that spoke louder than any declaration. As they rolled down the main street, faces filled windows and doorways. The whispers came, but they sounded different now. Not cruel, stunned, wary. Respect edged with disbelief. They weren't there to beg. They were there to stand. The town meeting filled the saloon, the only building large enough to contain both judgment and curiosity. The air reeked of old beer, sawdust, and moral certainty. Every bench was crowded, every wall lined with watching eyes. At the front sat Ormond Valak, stiff-backed and uneasy, fingers tapping nervously against the table. Beside him stood Pastor Halric Dorn, his expression carved from stern conviction. Yet the true gravity in the room belonged to Voilor Blackrin. He occupied the front row with relaxed confidence, his lips curved in a knowing smile. The Blackrin riders fanned out behind him like shadows ready to move. Ormond cleared his throat and struck the gavel. Weak, hollow. The sound echoed once. Then silence fell, and all eyes turned toward Evelyn Crowan and Thorn Calderix, standing side by side, unbowed. The council meeting is hereby called to order, Ormond Valak announced, his voice thin as he scanned the crowded saloon. His fingers tapped the table in front of him. We are gathered to address a matter of public concern, one that speaks to the moral standing of our community and the reputation of Ashvale Crossing. Before anyone else could rise, Valor Blackren stood. He did not wait for permission. The room bent toward him instinctively. Mayor, pastor, good folk of this town, he began, his tone wrapped in false humility. It grieves me that we must meet under such circumstances. We are a God-fearing people. We work the land with honest hands. We raise our children with values meant to endure. He paused, letting the silence swell. But those values, he continued, are now under threat. He turned sharply, extending a rigid finger toward the back of the room, toward Thorn Calderix and Evelyn Crowan. This man, Thorn Calderix, long respected among us, has invited impropriety into his household. A woman of uncertain origin, no family, no references, living among young, unmarried men. Murmurs rippled outward. He displays this arrangement openly, Blackren pressed on, as though decency itself were something to be mocked. What message does that send to our wives, our daughters? I do not speak from spite, only from concern for the soul of this town. Several women nodded, lips pursed tight with judgment. To them, Evelyn's poverty, her solitude, and her place beside Thorn confirmed every rumor they'd already decided to believe. Before the murmurs could grow louder, Thorn stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The stillness in his eyes silenced the room faster than any shout. You're right about one thing, Blackren, Thorn said quietly. His voice carried like distant thunder. We are here to talk about character. He turned, letting his gaze sweep the saloon, ranchers, merchants, mothers, men who had known drought and lost themselves. So let's speak plainly. He gestured toward Evelyn, his voice softening but growing stronger. This woman came to Ashvale Crossing with nothing but worn clothes and hands willing to work. She came after burying both her parents within the same season. His jaw tightened. Where was your concern then? Did any of you offer her a meal? A job? No. You offered her whispers, side glances, judgment. He took another step forward. I gave her work, cooking, cleaning, honest labor, and she has done it better than anyone I've ever hired, from before sunrise to after dark, without complaint. A few heads lowered. When one of my men was injured, she treated him with steadier hands and more courage than most men in this room. He turned fully toward Blackren. You want to talk about shadows? The only shadow here is cast by your greed. You don't care about this town's soul. You care about my land, my water. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. You've tried to poison my cattle. You've tried to buy my men. And now you're trying to ruin her name because you think she's a way to break me. His voice hardened. You're wrong. He faced the room again, his words ringing clear. Evelyn Crowan is a woman of honor. A breath caught somewhere in the crowd. She stands under my protection. Any insult toward her is an insult toward me. Any threat against her is a threat against the Ashvale hands. He paused. Keep that in mind before you start throwing stones. Silence dropped like a weight. No one had ever heard Thorn Calderix speak that long, or with such fire. Blackren's face darkened, fury tightening his jaw. This was not the response he had expected. Before Ormond Valak could stammer for order, a quieter sound broke through the stillness. A woman's voice. "I am not a shadow." Evelyn stepped forward from beside Thorn. Her hands were clasped tightly, but her back was straight. Fear twisted inside her chest, yet the memory of the night before steadied her feet. "I am a person," she said. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. "My name is Evelyn Crowan." She lifted her chin. "My father was Garin Crowan, an honest farmer until the drought took everything from him, just as it has taken from many of you." Eyes shifted. "When I came here, I was a stranger. I understand that. But I never asked for charity. I asked for work." She looked around the room, not at a mob, but at faces. "Thorn Calderix gave me that chance. I earned my wage. I earned his trust." Her gaze found Cale Morin, standing awkwardly near the wall, his arm still bound in a sling. "Some of you question my character," she continued softly. "Ask him who cleaned his wound. Ask who set his arm when there was no doctor within half a day's ride." Kyle swallowed and nodded once. Evelyn drew a breath. "I have done nothing here that I am ashamed of." The room remained silent, but the balance had shifted. And for the first time, Valor Blackrin realized the town might not bend as easily as he had planned. "Character isn't built from gossip," Evelyn Crowan said steadily. "It's built from what a person does." Her voice carried through the saloon, calm, unshaking. "I have cooked your meals. I have mended your shirts. And when a man was hurt, I helped him because it was right, not because anyone was watching." Several townsfolk shifted on their benches. Brusque Halden had made sure word of her tending Cale Morin spread quietly through Ashvale Crossing. And now that truth stood in sharp contrast to the ugly portrait Valor Blackrin had tried to paint. Evelyn turned then, her gaze settling directly on him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her dignity cut deeper than shouting ever could. "The only dishonor I've found in this territory," she said clearly, "is the belief that a person's worth is measured by money, or that a woman's good name can be dragged through the dirt by a powerful man for his own gain." The room held its breath. "My honor is not for sale, Mr. Blackrin," she continued, "and it does not belong to you to judge." Silence fell. Heavy. Complete. Blackrin stood rigid, his face flushing dark with rage and humiliation. He had been stripped bare not by a rival rancher, but by the woman he meant to destroy. Seeing the moment slip away, Ormond Valak slammed the gavel down hard. "This matter is clearly a private dispute between ranchers," he declared hastily. "This meeting is adjourned." The crowd broke apart in confused murmurs. The wall of condemnation had cracked. While suspicion still lingered in some eyes, something new had taken root. Doubt. As Thorn Calderix led Evelyn from the saloon, several townspeople who once looked away now met her gaze. Not warmly, but with reluctant respect. The ride back to the ranch passed in silence. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the stillness that follows a battle won, with the grim understanding that the war had only begun. The answer came that very night. It came without warning. Under cover of darkness, the Blackrin riders slipped onto Calderic's land. They didn't fire a shot. They didn't touch the house. Their damage was quieter, deliberate. At dawn, Brusque Halden found it. Nearly half a mile of fence along the northern pasture had been destroyed. Wire cut clean, posts smashed flat. Cattle scattered across open range, some already drifting toward Blackrin territory, ready to be claimed under false pretense. But that wasn't the worst. burned deep into the main gatepost, carved with a red-hot branding iron, were words blackened into the wood. "Next time, it will be blood." Thorn stood before the gate, one hand resting near the pistol at his hip. Evelyn stood beside him. The victory in town felt hollow now, a skirmish before something far darker. He stared at the ruined fence, the scattered herd, the threats seared into his land, and understood at last. This was no longer about reputation, no longer about rumor, no longer even about pride. Violor Blackrin had been humiliated publicly, and men like him answered shame with destruction. This was now a fight for survival, a war written not in whispers, but in the language of the West. Fire, iron, and blood. The following 2 days were the eye of the storm. A heavy vigilance settled over the ranch. Every man understood the brand on the gate wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Thorn organized defenses with cold precision. Rifles were cleaned, ammunition counted. Positions assigned across the house, the barn, the bunkhouse. What had once been open land became a fortress waiting for a siege. Thorn rarely left Evelyn's side. His presence was constant, protective, silent, coiled like a drawn blade. On the second night, as darkness bled across the sky, he came to her in the kitchen. Lamps glowed warmly, pretending peace. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "when they come, I want you in the root cellar. Bar the door from inside." His jaw tightened. "No matter what you hear, do not come out. Do you understand?" She was wiping the long wooden table. She didn't stop. "I understand," she said. Then she asked softly, "And where will you be?" "I'll be where I need to be." She turned to face him at last. The love born in a storm had now been tempered by fire. "My parents' farm was taken by drought," she said gently, "but they never ran from it." Her eyes held his, steady, unafraid. "And neither will I." They would face it together, to the very end. "This is my home now," Evelyn Crowan said quietly. "Thorn, my place is with you." His jaw tightened. "This isn't a drought," Thorn Calderix replied hoarsely. "This is Black Rin. It'll be bullets and bodies." The fear in his voice was naked. He had only just found her, and the thought of losing her carved something raw inside his chest. "I know," she said. She crossed the room to where several rifles leaned against the wall. Her fingers wrapped around a heavy Winchester. It felt foreign, but purposeful. She had learned to shoot as a girl, guarding chickens from foxes. She had never imagined it would lead here. "I won't hide in a cellar while my home burns," she said steadily. "And I won't leave the man I love to fight alone." He studied her. The steadiness of her hands, the fire in her eyes, the unyielding set of her jaw. To argue now would be to deny the strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. Fear twisted in his gut, but pride rose with it. He gave one sharp nod. The choice was made. The attack came just before midnight. The moon was only a sliver, smothered by clouds. The first warning was a dog's frantic barking, cut short by a sickening yelp. Then the night exploded. Gunfire shattered the front windows. Glass burst inward. Lamps flickered and died. At the same instant, orange light flared from the direction of the barn. "They're trying to burn us out," Brusque Holden roared from the front window. The world dissolved into chaos. Rifle cracks, screaming horses, splintering wood. Muzzle flashes lit the yard in hellish snapshots, revealing dark figures darting between buildings. The main house became a command post. Thorn, Evelyn, and Brusque held inside. Cale Morin and 2 others fired from the bunkhouse, laying down crossfire. The remaining Ashvale hands fought flames in the barn while returning shots through smoke. "They're splitting us," Thorne shouted. "Hold your ground. Make every round count." Evelyn dropped behind an overturned table. The rifle pressed tight to her shoulder. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but her hands stayed calm. She sighted on a shadow running past the burning barn. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard. The shadow fell. A wave of sickness and grim resolve rolled through her. This was survival. Smoke thickened. The air reeked of fire and blood. A bullet tore through the wall inches from her head, spraying splinters across her hair. She didn't flinch. She reloaded. From the bunkhouse, Cale's rifle answered again and again. Steady, determined. He and the others had pinned down a group advancing on the house. Then a torch arced through the darkness. It landed on the bunkhouse roof. Flames caught instantly. "They've got to get out," Brusque shouted, dropping an attacker with a clean shot. The bunkhouse door burst open. The three men ran, firing as they sprinted toward the house. Two made it. Kyle Morin stumbled. A dark bloom spread across his chest. He fell hard and did not rise. A cry tore from Brusque's throat. He surged from cover, grief and fury twisting his face. "You sons of bitches," he screamed, firing wildly into the darkness. "Brusque, get down," Thorne roared. Too late, a rifle cracked. Brusque staggered, clutching his side, then slid down the wall, leaving a red smear behind him. Thorne was at his side in seconds. But one look told him the truth. Brusque gripped his arm, breath ragged. "Protect the girl," he rasped. Then his eyes went empty. Grief hit Thorne like a blade to the chest. Brusque Halden had stood beside him for 20 years. He wasn't just a foreman. He was family. And now he was gone. There was no time to mourn. Only rage remained. The assault surged again. Sensing weakness, the Black Rin riders charged from the dark, shouting as they advanced. And that was when Evelyn saw him. Vylor Blackrin stood near the corral, half lit by firelight, watching it all like a man admiring his own destruction. He wasn't firing. He was commanding. Vylor Blackrin stood back like a dark general, barking orders through the smoke. And his eyes locked onto the window where Thorne Calderix crouched. Grief for Brusque Halden, twisting his face into something cruel. Vylor slowly lifted his pistol, carefully, deliberately. Time seemed to stretch thin. The thunder of gunfire dulled into a distant roar inside Evelyn Crowan's ears. She saw the faint glint of steel, the cold intent in Vylor's eyes, the exposed line of Thorne's back. She didn't cry out. There was no time. She didn't think. She screamed and moved. Evelyn hurled herself across the floor, slamming into Thorne with everything she had. They crashed sideways just as the shot rang out. The bullet meant for his heart tore through her shoulder instead. White-hot pain detonated through her body. The impact flung her hard to the floor. For a breathless instant, the world vanished. Then it returned in a blur of agony. Thorne spun, seeing her down, her hand pressed to her shoulder, blood slipping between her fingers. Her blood, spilled for him. Something inside him broke. The last restraint, the last piece of the man who still believed in mercy. Gone. A sound tore from his throat. Raw, animal. He looked at Evelyn, then at the doorway. Then he rose. He moved with terrifying calm, not running, not hiding, but advancing like death given shape. He stepped onto the porch as bullets hissed past him, both pistols drawn. "Blackrin!" he roared. His voice rolled across the burning yard. The fight stuttered. Men on both sides turned. Vylor stood in the open, surprised his shot had failed, a crooked smile still on his face. So the ghost finally steps out, he sneered. Thorn answered with silence. He walked forward, each step steady, each shot precise. The Black Rin riders, seeing his eyes, began to falter. This was no longer a land dispute. This was judgment. Vylor fired again, wide. Thorn kept coming. A man fell, then another. The riders broke, fleeing into the darkness they had crawled from, leaving their master alone. 20 yards separated them. Flames lit the bodies. Smoke curled around their feet. "This is for Brusque Halden," Thorn roared. His left pistol thundered. The shot shattered Valor's leg. He screamed and dropped to one knee. "And this is for Cale Morin." The right pistol barked. The bullet smashed his gun hand. The weapon spun uselessly into the dirt. Thorn stopped, stood over him. Vylor looked up, pain and hatred twisting together, and beneath it, something new. Fear. "You're dead, Calderix," he spat. "Not tonight," Thorn said, his voice colder than the grave. He didn't fire again. He holstered both pistols. Then he seized Vylor by the collar and hauled him upright, dragging him toward the burning barn where horses shrieked in terror. "What are you doing?" Vylor screamed, struggling weakly. Thorn's face was carved from fury. "You brought fire to my home," he said. "Now you face it." Above them, part of the barn roof gave way with a thunderous crack, sending sparks raining into the sky. A stall burst open. A horse, eyes wild, mane aflame, tore free, screaming as it bolted blindly into the yard. A creature of pure panic, it charged straight toward them. Thorn reacted on instinct, shoving Vylor away and diving aside. Vylor, wounded and off balance, stumbled backward, directly into the path of the burning animal. There was a sickening impact. A human scream cut short. Then the horse vanished into the night, a streak of fire and madness. Vylor Blackrin lay twisted in the dirt, broken and unmoving. The war for Ashvale Crossing was over, but the cost still burned. His reign of terror did not end with a bullet, but with the chaos he himself had unleashed. A heavy silence settled over the ranch, broken only by the pop of dying flames and the low groans of the wounded. The fight was finished. Thorn Calderix forced himself upright, the fury draining from his body until only a vast, aching emptiness remained. He glanced once at Vylor Blackrin's ruined form and felt nothing at all. Then panic struck. He turned and ran for the house. He found Evelyn Crowan where he had left her, slumped against the wall, pale, trembling, but awake. Her teeth were clenched against the pain. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering, terrified to touch her. "Thorn," she whispered, her lashes fluttering open. "You're safe," he choked. Hot tears spilled freely down his face. He gathered her carefully into his arms, cradling her head against his chest as if she were made of glass. He had won. The ranch still stood. Yet as he looked out at the smoking wreckage of his life, the burned buildings, the men who had died defending him, and felt the warm stickiness of Evelyn's blood on his hands, he understood the truth. This victory carried a wound that would never fully close. Dawn broke over the ranch without mercy. Clear blue sky revealed devastation in full. The blackened frames of the barn and bunkhouse rose like skeletons against the morning light. The yard was torn apart, mud churned with blood, debris scattered among fallen men and horses. The silence left behind was deeper than the roar that had preceded it. Inside the house, the chaos turned inward. Moving as if in a trance, Thorn laid Evelyn gently across the kitchen table. The bullet had passed clean through her shoulder, painful but not fatal. His hands, hardened by years of rope and labor, moved with unexpected tenderness as he cleaned the wound with whiskey and packed it with clean linen. His face remained carved from stone, but his eyes betrayed the terror that still gripped him. He sent Taryn Fox, one of the few men left uninjured, riding hard for the doctor in Ashevale Crossing. "Ride like the devil's on your heels," Thorne rasped. The news struck the town like a hammer. Taryn arrived soot-streaked and hollow-eyed. He told the story in the middle of the street, voice cracking as grief bled through every word. He spoke of the siege, of Blackrin's betrayal, of the deaths of Brusque Halden and young Cale Morin. And then he told them how Evelyn Crowan had stood her ground, how she had taken a bullet meant for Thorne Calderix. The whispers that once condemned her now spread again, but this time in stunned, reverent disbelief. When Dr. Everett Sloan arrived hours later, his expression darkened at the sight of the yard, the armed men standing watch, the bodies laid beneath blankets. He said little. Inside, he treated Evelyn with practiced efficiency. "You're very lucky," he told her as he secured the bandage. "Very foolish, and very brave. That bullet missed your lung by the width of a breath." "Is Thorne all right?" she asked weakly. "He's still standing," the doctor muttered, glancing toward the corner where Thorne remained unmoving, a man intact in body only. As he prepared to leave, Dr. Sloan paused and laid a hand on Thorne's arm. "The boy told the town what happened," he said quietly. "What she did." He hesitated. "The story's changed now, Calderix. You'll see it soon enough." The days that followed became a purgatory of grief and labor. They buried Brusque Halden and Cale Morin on a low rise overlooking the land they had died defending, beneath a lone oak that bent but never broke. There were no speeches, only the choking silence of hardened men, and the tears that slid freely down Evelyn's cheeks. Thorne stood before the fresh graves, hat in his hands, his face unreadable. A part of him was laid to rest there with them. He threw himself into rebuilding with punishing intensity. From before sunrise until long after dusk, he worked as if motion alone could keep grief from swallowing him whole. The remaining Ashevale hands followed him without question now. Their loyalty had been forged in fire, blood, and shared loss. Evelyn, her arm bound in a sling, could not lift beams or mend fences, so she became the quiet center of their healing. She ran the house, cooked warm meals that brought moments of normalcy back into shattered days, tended to bruises, and to deeper wounds no bandage could reach. Most of all, she watched over Thorne. He had retreated again, not into cold distance, but into a cavern of guilt and pain. At night she heard him cry out in his sleep, trapped in memories of gunfire and dying men. She would rise then and sit beside his bed without words, remaining until the shaking stopped, a steady light in his storm. In the evenings, she placed food before him as he stared into the dead hearth, and she would not leave until he ate. Slowly, quietly, she kept him anchored to the world he was still learning how to live in. She learned the language of his silence. Evelyn knew when to remain beside him and when to step away and let the darkness pass on its own. One night, as she turned to leave his room, his voice stopped her, rough and barely more than breath. "This was my doing," Thorne Calderix said into the dark. "I brought this down on them. On you." She turned back at once. Crossing the room, she knelt before his chair and wrapped both of her steady hands around his large, scarred one. "No," she said firmly. "This was Valor Blackrin's evil, not yours. His greed, his cruelty." Her voice strengthened as the words came. "You gave those men a place to belong, a reason to stand. They chose to honor that. And you gave me a life, Thorn. We didn't run. We fought for our home. Together. He lifted his eyes to hers, and the pain in them was so deep it stole her breath. Slowly, he leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. For the first time since the night of the attack, he stopped holding himself together. His body trembled as silent sobs tore through him. Evelyn held him, her slight frame somehow strong enough to bear the weight of his grief. She did not speak. She simply stayed, proving that what bound them now was more than desire. It was endurance. It was love, tempered by loss. As Dr. Everett Sloan had predicted, the world beyond the ranch began to shift. Several days later, a wagon rattled up the lane from Ashevale Crossing. It was Bren Hollow, the storekeeper, his hat clutched awkwardly in his hands. Without many words, he unloaded flour, coffee, and salted meat. "On the house," he muttered, avoiding Thorn's eyes. "For what you suffered, the town, we're sorry." He was only the first. Ranchers from neighboring spreads began to ride in, offering lumber, nails, and extra hands. Stray cattle were returned without question. No demands were made. Even Ormond Valek came himself, hat in hand, delivering a stiff, stumbling apology on behalf of the council. And when they spoke of Evelyn, the tone had changed. No one called her Miss Crowan anymore. Among the men, she was simply Evelyn. Among the townsfolk, she was something else entirely. They called her the Woman of Ashevale, not in gossip, but in respect. A title earned not through words, but through blood and courage. Nearly a month after the attack, the new frames of the barn and bunkhouse stood pale and raw against the sky. The ranch still bore scars, but it was healing. One evening, Thorn and Evelyn stood side by side on the porch, watching the sunset spill rose and gold across the clouds. The quiet no longer carried dread. It carried promise. "I saw Pastor Halric Dorn in town yesterday," Thorn said at last. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "He asked after you." "That was kind of him," Evelyn replied softly, sensing the rest. Thorn turned to her then, the hard lines of grief softened by twilight. "He also asked about us, about what we intend." He took her uninjured hand in his. "I told him this ranch has been without a proper mistress for too long," he said. "And that I mean to ask you to be my wife." His gaze was open, unguarded. "I know it's not the right way. There's no parlor, no ring. It feels small after everything we've survived." Evelyn smiled, a real smile, bright enough to warm the evening air. She lifted his hand and pressed it gently to her cheek. "Thorn Calderix," she said softly, "after all we've endured, do you truly believe I care about fine rooms?" She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady proof of his life. "My answer was yes, the night you told me my heart was yours." She looked up at him. "It will always be yes." The wedding came a week later. It was simple and strong, like the land itself. Not in a church, but beneath open sky, with the healed earth as their witness. Pastor Halric Dorn stood with his Bible. The surviving Ashevale hands formed the line of groomsmen, scrubbed clean, hats in hand, pride shining openly in their eyes. The town came. Dr. Sloan, Bren Hollow and his wife. Even Ormond Valek stood near the front. A few of the women who had once judged Evelyn harshly stood quietly at the back. Their presence a silent admission of how deeply their view of her had changed. Evelyn wore a simple blue dress she had carefully mended herself. The color of clear sky after a storm. Thorn stood beside her, tall and unbowed. Their vows were not whispered. They were spoken clearly, carried by the breeze, promises made not in innocence, but in full understanding of what it meant to fight for and nearly lose everything. When Pastor Dorn finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," a cheer erupted from the cowboys. Thorn did not offer a polite kiss. He pulled his bride into his arms and kissed her deeply, fiercely, a declaration for all to witness. This was his wife, and the celebration began in the open yard beneath the western sky. Amid the sounds of rebuilding, Tairn Fox lifted his fiddle beneath the open sky, and the sorrowful waltzes of the past gave way to bright, hopeful reels. Laughter drifted between half-raised beams and stacked lumber. They were a small, scarred family, but they were whole again. As dusk settled in, Thorn Calderix stood with his arm firm around his wife's waist. When Ormond Valak approached to offer his congratulations, Thorn met him with a genuine, unguarded smile. "Mayor," he said, pride resonating deeper than any claim to land, "allow me to formally introduce my wife, Evelyn Crowan Calderix." The months slipped quietly into one another. The raw wounds carved into the ranch softened as time passed. Autumn arrived, brushing the cottonwoods in fire-bright gold and deep orange. The rebuilt barn and bunkhouse rose strong against the horizon, the scent of fresh-cut pine carrying the promise of endurance and new beginnings. The rhythm of the ranch returned, slower, more solemn than before, yet steady, like a heart that had survived a brutal fever and learned how to beat again. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Thorn and Evelyn walked hand in hand up the gentle hill, where two lone wooden markers stood watch. The crosses, weathered now by wind and rain, marked the resting places of Brusk Halden and Cale Morin. It had become their quiet ritual, a pilgrimage of remembrance. They stood for a long while, gazing across the wide valley that was their world. The herd, smaller but strong, grazed peacefully. Smoke curled in a thin ribbon from the cookhouse chimney. The air was cool and clean. It was peace, real, fragile peace. "He would have liked the new barn," Thorn said softly, speaking of Brusk. "Always claimed the old one could freeze the devil himself. And Cale would have carved his initials into one of the beams by now," Evelyn added, a faint, tender smile touching her lips. The grief no longer bled openly. It had settled into a quiet ache, permanent, familiar, woven into the fabric of their life. Thorn squeezed her hand. "I still see them at night," he admitted. "The fire, the shots. I see you fall." His voice thickened with memory. "I don't know if it'll ever stop." Evelyn turned to him, her gaze steady, patient as the land beneath their feet. "Maybe it won't," she said gently. "But the ghosts don't get the final word." She met his eyes. "We're the ones still breathing. We owe it to them, and to ourselves, to live fully." He looked down at her. This woman who had stood before a mob, fought in gunfire and taken a bullet meant for him. She had taught him that a heart could shatter and still learn how to love. That a house filled with memory could become a home again. "Before you came," he said quietly, "I was only waiting to die." This land was a tomb, a monument to Elowen Calderix and Cale Calderix. I kept it going out of duty, not hope. He drew her close. "You came here and planted life back into dead soil. Evelyn, you made me want a future again." They both knew that future would not be gentle. This was still the West. Law lay a hard ride away. Drought could return without warning. Outlaws still haunted the territories. The peace they'd earned was not a promise. It was a reprieve. Vylor Blackrin was gone, but men like him would always exist. Greed and violence were as much a part of the frontier as sagebrush and stone. "We won't face it alone this time," Avalyn whispered, sensing his thoughts. She rested her head on his shoulder, and together they looked out across their land. She was right. The fire had forged them into something stronger. The remaining Ashvale hands were no longer hired men. They were family, bound by blood, loss, and loyalty. And Ashvale Crossing, once a place of suspicion, had become a cautious ally. In a country where character weighed more than gold, they had earned something rare. As they walked back down the hill, the setting sun stretched their shadows across the earth. No longer two solitary figures, but one united shape moving forward together. Upon that land, their life had written its truth. That love, fierce and unyielding, could rise from ash. That loyalty, freely chosen, could build a fortress stronger than fear. Stronger than any beam of timber, and proof that courage, when born in the most unlikely heart, could stare straight into the mouth of a gun and choose a different fate. The following morning, Avalyn Crowan knelt in the narrow patch of earth just beyond the ranch house. The soil was dark and rich from the recent rains. At her side lay a small, thorn-wrapped bundle tied in burlap. Thorn Calderix stepped onto the porch with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and paused to watch her. She worked the ground with steady hands. No longer soft, no longer unsure, but capable and sure of purpose. "What have you got there?" he asked, curiosity warm in his voice. She glanced up, dirt smudged across her cheek, her eyes bright. "I bought it from a traveler yesterday. He said it came from the east, but it was bred to survive." She loosened the burlap carefully, revealing the tangled roots of a young rose bush. "A wild rose," she said. "He told me it can live through bitter winters and dry summers. Doesn't need much care, just a place to take root." Thorn came down the steps and knelt beside her. He accepted the small bush from her hands, his own rough palms unexpectedly gentle, as he lowered it into the hollow she had prepared. "A little like you," he said quietly, looking at her. "Beautiful, and tougher than anyone ever realizes." Avalyn smiled, color rising in her cheeks. "I was thinking it's more like us," she said softly. "It has thorns to protect itself, but it still chooses to bloom, even in hard ground." Together, they filled the hole, their hands working side by side, pressing soil back over the roots. When the last earth was packed down, Thorn's hand rested over hers, firm and steady. It was a simple gesture, but it was also a vow, a promise to grow something new, a promise to set roots deep, a promise to build a life together in this harsh, beautiful land they now called home. They rose, brushing dirt from their knees. The small rose bush looked fragile against the vast sweep of pasture and sky, tiny, thorned, uncertain. Yet they both knew what lived inside it. Endurance, hope, the quiet certainty that life could rise again. It stood as a final sign that the ghosts of yesterday no longer ruled this house. The future did, and for the first time in many years, Thorn Calderix looked at his land, at his wife, and saw not an ending, but a beginning. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us. Subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. from our hearts to yours. Thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.